Mark and I had been together long enough for people to assume permanence. We shared rent, routines, and a quiet understanding that came from years of choosing each other. But lately, that understanding had thinned into something brittle. Conversations ended faster. Touch felt scheduled. When I spoke about my day, Mark nodded without really hearing, as if his attention had already moved on to the next obligation. I told myself this was normal. Love, I believed, matured into quiet. Lucas never let silence settle. He had been my friend since before Mark, easy laughter, steady presence, the kind of person who remembered small details without trying. When Mark worked late or drifted into his phone, Lucas was the one who texted, asking if I wanted to walk, talk, or just sit somewhere with bad music and decent coffee. I never questioned the comfort. Friendship was allowed to feel warm, I told myself. Friendship could be close. The night of the party arrived during one of those stretches where Mark and I barely intersected. A mutual friend was celebrating a promotion, and the apartment buzzed with voices and spilled drinks. Music thumped through the walls. People laughed louder than necessary. I watched Mark move through the room like a guest in his own life, polite but distant, already checking the time. Lucas showed up late, cheeks flushed from the cold, grin careless. He hugged me longer than expected, the way he always did, as if grounding himself. I felt it then, a small, unsettling awareness, but brushed it aside. The room was crowded. Everyone was drinking. Context explained everything. The night wore on, Mark's patience thinned. He kissed my cheek and said he was tired. I asked him to stay. He said maybe next time. The door closed behind him with a soft finality that lingered longer than it should have. Lucas noticed. He always did that. We talked near the kitchen sink, shouting over the music, sharing stories we'd already told each other but needed to repeat. His words came looser as the alcohol took hold. Mine followed. The world narrowed to the space between us, to the way his eyes searched my face when I spoke, as if what I said mattered more than the noise around us. By midnight, the party dissolved into fragments, people leaving in pairs, others passed out on couches. Lucas swayed when he stood, laughing it off, but I saw the fatigue behind his smile. I offered him my bed without thinking. It was practical. Responsible. He protested weakly, then accepted, gratitude softening his features. I took the couch, or at least that was the plan. The apartment settled into an unfamiliar quiet once the last guest left. I turned off lights, rinsed empty glasses, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. Upstairs, the bed creaked as Lucas shifted. I told myself I was being a good friend. I told myself this was nothing. Sleep came unevenly. At some point, I woke to the sound of rain tapping the windows, the apartment dim and unfamiliar. I felt the couch beneath me, but also something else, a sense of displacement, as if my body didn't quite belong where it was. I remember thinking I should check on Lucas, make sure he hadn't gotten sick, make sure he was okay. The next thing I registered was warmth, not the ambient warmth of a room, but the kind that radiates from another person. A presence close enough that I could feel breath, slow and steady, against my shoulder. My eyes stayed closed, fear and confusion tangling in my chest. I told myself I was dreaming, that exhaustion and alcohol had rearranged reality. Then I recognized the scent, familiar, unmistakable. Lucas. My heart began to pound, not from panic alone, but from something more dangerous, awareness. I lay still, suspended between waking and sleep, between what was and what shouldn't be. The rain continued outside, patient and persistent, as if giving me time to decide whether I would open my eyes, or let the moment choose for me. And in that fragile pause, I understood that whatever happened next would not be accidental. I opened my eyes slowly, as if clarity might hurt less if I approached it gently. Lucas lay beside me, close enough that the line between our bodies had disappeared. He wasn't touching me in any obvious way, yet the intimacy of the moment felt undeniable. His breathing was uneven now, no longer the deep rhythm of sleep. He was awake. We both were. Neither of us spoke, and that silence carried more weight than any confession. I'm sorry, Lucas whispered at last, the words settled heavily between us. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see his face in the dim light. He looked stripped of his usual confidence, eyes glassy, jaw tense, as if he were bracing for impact. I should have moved away. I should have said his name sharply, reminded him of boundaries, of Mark, of everything that made this wrong. Instead, I asked the one question that would make retreat impossible: for what? Lucas swallowed. For crossing a line I've been standing near for a long time. The honesty startled me. It was too early for lies, too late for pretending. He stared at the ceiling as he spoke, voice low and steady despite the tremor underneath. He told me he hadn't planned to end up in my bed, that alcohol only loosened what had already been there. He told me he had tried to ignore it, tried to be just my friend, but watching me feel unseen had slowly undone him. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said. Or him. Mark's name echoed in my head even though Lucas didn't say it. Guilt rose sharp and immediate, but it tangled with something else: relief. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to ache that I thought of Mark leaving the party without looking back. Of conversations that never quite reached the surface. Of the quiet erosion I'd mistaken for stability. None of that excused what was happening, but it explained why my body didn't pull away, that I turned toward Lucas fully then. Our faces were inches apart, close enough to see the uncertainty flicker across his expression. I realized how carefully he was waiting, giving me space to decide, to stop everything if I chose. That restraint felt more intimate than any touch. This can't happen, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I know, Lucas replied. I just needed you to know why it almost did. Almost. The word hovered there, fragile and misleading. Because even as he said it, the space between us vanished. Our foreheads touched, a simple, devastating gesture. It wasn't a kiss. It was worse. It was permission that in that moment, I wasn't thinking about consequences. I was thinking about how long it had been since someone met me where I was. Since someone saw me not as an obligation, but as a choice. The betrayal wasn't in a single act, it was in the surrender, quiet and deliberate. When the morning light crept through the curtains, reality followed close behind. Lucas was already sitting up, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The closeness had retreated, leaving behind an awkward distance that felt colder than absence. I wrapped myself in the sheet, suddenly aware of everything we had blurred and nothing we had resolved. I don't expect anything from you, Lucas said without turning around. I just couldn't keep pretending. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. My chest felt tight, crowded with emotions I couldn't sort: guilt for Mark, tenderness for Lucas, disappointment in myself. There was no clean way out of this. Only choices, each carrying their own damage. Lucas stood and dressed quietly. At the door, he hesitated, hand resting on the frame as if memorizing the space. Whatever happens, he said, I don't regret telling the truth. After he left, I sat alone on the bed, the imprint of his presence still warm beside me. The apartment felt different now, charged with a knowledge I couldn't undo. I knew I would have to face Mark. I knew Lucas and I would never be simple again, and I knew, with a clarity that frightened me, that the hardest part wasn't what had happened, but what it revealed about what I'd been missing all along. The silence Lucas left behind lingered longer than I expected. For hours after he walked out, I moved through the apartment without direction, touching familiar objects as if they might explain what I'd done. The bed felt too large. The air felt heavier. What unsettled me most wasn't guilt alone, it was recognition. I had crossed a line not because I was careless, but because part of me had been starving. Mark came home that evening, later than usual. I heard his keys before I saw him, the familiar rhythm that once brought comfort. He asked how the party went, shrugging off his jacket, already halfway distracted. I watched him carefully, wondering how someone could feel so close and so unreachable at the same time. Fine, I said at first. The lie came easily. Too easily that we sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the space between us filled with things unsaid. Mark talked about work, about deadlines and meetings, and finally noticed my quiet. He paused, eyes narrowing with concern that arrived too late. What's wrong? he asked that I could have chosen the easier truth, that we'd grown apart, that things hadn't felt right for a while. Instead, I chose the honest one. I told him someone else had crossed an emotional boundary with me. I didn't offer details. I didn't need to. The damage lived in my voice. Mark leaned back, hands clasped together, absorbing the words slowly. Hurt flickered across his face, followed by something more resigned than angry. "Did you want it to happen?" he asked, the question pierced deeper than accusation. I hesitated, then nodded. That was when he looked away that we talked long into the night, finally saying the things we'd been avoiding for months. He admitted he'd known I was drifting. I admitted I'd felt invisible. There was pain, but also clarity, a shared understanding that what broke us hadn't begun that morning. It had started much earlier, in missed moments and unmet needs. By the end of the conversation, nothing dramatic remained to be said. We didn't fight. We didn't beg. We acknowledged what had ended, and that quiet acceptance hurt more than anger would have. When Mark left the apartment for the last time, I stood by the door and watched him go, aware that I was grieving something that had already been gone. Days passed before I heard from Lucas. His message was simple: "Can we talk?" I agreed, though I wasn't sure what I could offer beyond honesty. That we met at a park where we'd once spent afternoons laughing about nothing important. Now, everything felt important. Lucas looked tired, guarded, as if he'd been carrying the weight of that morning alone. He didn't touch me. He didn't smile. "I didn't want to complicate your life," he said. "I just couldn't keep lying." "I know," I replied. "And I don't blame you." We talked carefully, acknowledging what had happened without romanticizing it. I told him about Mark, about the ending that followed. Lucas listened, guilt shadowing his expression. He apologized again, not for how he felt, but for the timing. "I don't know what this makes us now," he said quietly. That I considered the question. Friendship felt altered, fragile. Romance felt premature, built on the ruins of something else. "It makes us honest," I said finally. "But it doesn't mean we rush into anything." Lucas nodded, relief and disappointment coexisting in his eyes. That we parted that day without promises, without labels. Just understanding. That night, alone again, I reflected on the story I'd tell myself about what happened. It would be easy to frame it as betrayal alone, to reduce it to a single night. But the truth was more complicated, and more uncomfortable. Infidelity didn't arrive loudly in my life. It crept in quietly, disguised as comfort, fueled by neglect, sustained by silence. It taught me that loyalty isn't only about resisting temptation, it's about tending to what you've chosen before it withers. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I knew this chapter wasn't about regret alone. It was about awareness. About recognizing what I needed, and the cost of ignoring it for too long. The bed was empty now, but for the first time in a while, I felt awake. Time didn't heal anything on its own, it only made space for truth to surface. Weeks passed after that final conversation with Lucas, and life settled into a quieter rhythm. The apartment became mine alone, no longer shared, no longer negotiated. At first, the silence felt punishing. Then, slowly, it became instructive. Without Mark's routines or Lucas's constant presence, I was left with myself, and the unanswered questions I'd avoided for years. That I replayed the night of the party often, not to relive it, but to understand it. The infidelity hadn't been born from recklessness or alcohol. It had grown from accumulation. Every moment I'd swallowed disappointment, every time I'd chosen peace over honesty, every night I'd accepted emotional absence as the price of stability. Facing that truth was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying. Mark and I spoke once more, briefly, to exchange final belongings. There was no bitterness left between us, only a subdued politeness. He looked lighter somehow, as if release had followed loss. We wished each other well without ceremony. When he walked away, I felt sadness, but not regret. Some endings arrive only after we stop pretending they aren't necessary. Lucas remained at a distance, respectful of the space I'd asked for. When we did speak, it was careful, measured. He never pressured me to define what we were or what we might become. That restraint mattered. It told me that whatever existed between us could wait, or survive not being chosen at all. One evening, months later, I invited him to walk with me. The city lights reflected off wet pavement, and the air carried the promise of rain. We talked about ordinary things at first: work, movies, trivial complaints. Gradually, the conversation turned inward. I was afraid I ruined everything, Lucas admitted. You revealed something, I corrected gently. That's not the same. We stopped beneath a streetlight, the glow softening his features. I realized then that my feelings for him had changed. They weren't sharper or deeper, but clearer. I didn't want escape anymore. I wanted intention. I can't build something new on top of unfinished grief, I said. But I don't want to pretend this connection doesn't matter. Lucas nodded, understanding without argument. Then we let it be what it is, he said. For now. That answer felt right. Later that night, alone again, I reflected on the version of myself who had once mistaken endurance for devotion. Who believed staying quiet was kinder than speaking truth. Infidelity had forced me to confront that misconception, not to excuse what I'd done, but to learn from it that I didn't see myself as a villain anymore, nor as a victim of circumstance. I saw myself as human, capable of loving imperfectly, capable of choosing poorly, but also capable of growth. The real betrayal hadn't been toward Mark alone. It had been toward my own needs, ignored for the sake of comfort. As I lay in bed, I understood something I hadn't before: faithfulness isn't sustained by rules alone. It survives through attention, communication, and courage. When those fade, temptation doesn't need to shout, it only needs to wait. The story didn't end with a new relationship or a grand declaration. It ended with awareness. With accountability. With the quiet resolve to never again let silence decide for me, and as sleep finally claimed me, I knew that whatever came next, love, solitude, or something in between, it would be chosen with open eyes.